In the shadows of a stone fortress, power is not given. It is seized, whispered, and sometimes stolen under the flicker of torchlight. Here, loyalty is currency, deception a survival skill, and a single glance can decide life or death. Behind the king's commanding presence, unseen battles rage. Alliances form in silence, rivalries fester beneath polished floors, and secrets are weapons sharper than any sword. One misstep, one word too many, can erase a name from memory forever. But for those who learn the art of observation, patience, and subtle influence, the court offers something far greater than favor. It offers control. Step inside and discover the perilous game played in the king's shadow. In 1378, the castle of Château de Montfaucon loomed over the forest like a toothless predator, its battlements jagged against the stormy sky. Inside, King Alaric IV ruled not with justice, but with the slow, deliberate cruelty that made his court infamous across the realm. Courtiers whispered that the king's shadow was longer than his mercy, and history would record not the victories of his reign, but the suffering left in the wake of his paranoia. It began with the festival of St. Michael, a time when townsfolk were meant to dance in celebration of the harvest. Alaric, however, did not enjoy dancing. He enjoyed fear. On the night of the festival, a young scribe named Etienne arrived in the castle, clutching a parchment that contained rumors of conspiracy, rumors that would be enough to get him executed in any other kingdom. But here, in Alaric's court, it was merely an appetizer. The king had a habit of testing loyalty through what he called the king's shadow. No sword, no poison, no gallows, just his gaze. Etienne would sit in a chair under the flickering light of torches, and Alaric would silently study him for hours, noting every twitch, every nervous glance. It was psychological torture dressed as etiquette. One historian later wrote, "Alaric's shadow could strip a man of his courage before he even realized it." And it was true. Etienne's knees shook. His quill hovered above the parchment like a condemned man waiting for a guillotine that didn't exist. The king's paranoia was rooted in centuries of superstition. Montfaucon had been built on the site of a pagan cemetery, and legends claimed that restless spirits whispered into the ears of kings. Alaric believed them, or at least he used them as an excuse to keep his nobles in line. No one could enter the throne room without first passing a gauntlet of mirrors and smelling salts. The mirrors, Alaric insisted, reflected one's soul. The salts were to awaken hidden treachery. Courtiers joked in the kitchens that the king spent more time reading faces in mirrors than ruling. But laughter in Alaric's court was a dangerous luxury. That night, the festival drums echoed faintly through the stone halls. Etienne's eyes darted to the open windows, imagining the townsfolk dancing under the moonlight, blissfully unaware of the horrors within the castle walls. Some nights, Alaric would summon servants and noble children alike to witness punishments that were almost ceremonial in their grotesqueness. Rats, trapped in cages, were fed human flesh, supposedly to teach a lesson in cruelty. Servants swore that the rats would squeak in rhythm with the screams, composing a symphony of terror that haunted the castle corridors long after the punishments ended. And yet, there was method in Alaric's madness. He believed that fear could be measured, quantified, and used as currency. The king's shadow was a performance, one where loyalty could be mined, betrayal detected, and weakness exposed without a single drop of blood spilled, though blood often followed anyway, because nobody survived paranoia untouched. By the time Etienne had been studied for nearly 3 hours, he was trembling so violently that his parchment fell to the floor. Alaric did not move. He did not speak. He merely waited, as though the silence itself were a blade. Finally, the king leaned forward, his eyes black with intent. "Fear is a teacher," he whispered, more to the shadows than to Etienne. "And every shadow casts truth." Then he rose, leaving the scribe shivering, a man baptized not in water but in terror. Etienne would write in his journals years later that the king's shadow was worse than the rack, the stocks, or the dungeon. "The body may endure chains," he wrote, "but the mind crumbles before invisible hands." By the festival's end, Montfaucon had claimed its first victim, not with steel or flame, but with silence. The townsfolk cheered outside, utterly unaware that their king's shadow had stretched all the way into the marrow of the castle, claiming souls one glance at a time. And so began Alaric IV's reign of psychological terror, a reign that historians would call brilliant, monarchs would call cruel, and survivors would call unspeakable. The castle walls whispered, the rats squeaked, and the shadow of the king grew longer still. In the court of King Aldric, the corridors were alive with whispers, the air thick with perfume, dust, and danger. Every noblewoman, every chambermaid, even the faintest shadow of a servant, knew that proximity to the king was a currency more valuable than gold, more perilous than a sharpened dagger. To be chosen for the king's favor was a blessing, a curse, and a gamble all at once. The rumors were as lethal as the man himself. Some said Aldric could read a person's soul before they even knelt, while others swore he preferred cunning smiles to truth. No one knew which whispers to trust, and trusting the wrong one could cost more than one's life. Lady Seraphine was acutely aware of this. Her entrance to the royal court had been modest, her family's name respected but not influential. Yet she possessed a skill many overlooked, the ability to vanish into shadows, to smile without revealing thought, to listen without appearing intrusive. It was this very talent that caught the king's eye. One evening, during a grand banquet, a spilled goblet and a perfectly timed quip brought her into Aldric's view. What seemed trivial to others, a slip, a jest, was an audition she had not planned, but she played it with precision. The king's attention lingered. Favor in Aldric's court was rarely immediate. It arrived slowly, like poison through a chalice of wine. First came the small acknowledgments, a passing nod, a request for her opinion on a tapestry, a private invitation to the gardens where the scent of roses masked the whispers of intrigue. These were tests, though no one called them that aloud. Every smile, every careful gesture, weighed heavily against the backdrop of ambition and jealousy. Lady Seraphine knew that one misstep could erase months of careful observation. One word could brand her a traitor. One glance could summon envy sharp enough to draw blood. And yet, there was the allure. The king's favor promised access, secrets, and protection, but also a strange intimacy that unsettled even the strongest hearts. Lady Seraphine realized quickly that she was not the only one vying for his attention. Other women, trained in seduction, rhetoric, and deception, prowled the hallways like predators. Each encounter, each smile exchanged in candlelight, carried with it a hidden threat. To falter was to fall. To rise meant navigating a labyrinth built on whispered rumors, masked intentions, and the unrelenting hunger of power. The first true test arrived unexpectedly. A minor noblewoman, jealous of Seraphine's growing proximity to the king, attempted to humiliate her during a council meeting. Words were exchanged, subtle barbs that could have spiraled into disaster. Yet Seraphine remained composed. She responded not with anger, but with a measured observation, a comment so precise it reframed the conversation without overt confrontation. The court gasped, not for her audacity, but for the quiet mastery she displayed. Aldric's eyes, sharp and calculating, watched from the far end of the hall. By nightfall, Seraphine understood a painful truth. Favor was not granted lightly. It was a dance with shadows, a balance between obedience and cunning, vulnerability and control. The king's attention was a double-edged sword. To hold it was to court both opportunity and danger. She would need every ounce of wit and patience to maintain her standing, to survive the court's labyrinth of envy and ambition. And even then, survival was never guaranteed. By the end of the week, her reward came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Aldric summoned her to the private chambers of the West Wing, a room suffused with candlelight and the faint scent of jasmine. No words were exchanged at first. A glance, a nod, and the smallest smile, enough to convey favor, enough to mark her as chosen. Others would notice, but they could not touch her yet. In that moment, Seraphine realized that favor was not about protection or power alone. It was about presence. To be seen by the king was to wield influence, invisible but potent, shaping the currents of court from a shadowed corner. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, rattling windows and stirring candle flames. The court continued its relentless rhythm, unaware that a new player had emerged. Lady Seraphine, once a quiet observer, now held the fragile, dangerous gift of the king's attention. And with it came not only opportunity, but the silent promise of peril, waiting patiently in the corridors where shadows whispered and daggers glinted in the candlelight. In the gilded halls of Aldrich's court, beauty was not merely admired, it was demanded. Women carried their worth like jewels, polished and perilously fragile. Pale skin was prized above all else, a sign of delicacy and refinement, while the faintest blush hinted at both vitality and virtue. Yet the pursuit of beauty came with a silent, often invisible, toll. Behind the polished masks and embroidered gowns lurked poisons and potions potent enough to maim or kill. Every brush stroke of rouge, every dab of powder, was a gamble with mortality. Lady Seraphine observed this cruel theater with both fascination and dread. At the morning toilette, women would assemble before mirrors framed in gilded oak, mixing powders of lead and chalk with waters distilled from rose petals or violet leaves. The more refined the mixture, the paler the complexion it promised, but at a cost few dared to name aloud. Lead, while smoothing wrinkles and whitening skin, corroded bones, dulled minds, and poisoned blood. Mercury, added to achieve a delicate shimmer, caused tremors, sores, and teeth to blacken before falling. Women who appeared untouched by time were often victims of chemical warfare they administered upon themselves. Cosmetics were not the only peril. Hair, too, demanded sacrifice. To achieve the lofty, flowing styles favored by Aldrich, women applied mixtures of arsenic, burnt oils, and crushed herbs to encourage growth. Arsenic, they were told, strengthened the hair, made it glossy, and preserved the complexion. What they were not told was that each application gnawed at their organs, made their stomachs revolt, and caused fainting spells that could leave them prone on marble floors while courtiers whispered about their weakness. Beauty was literal self-destruction, wrapped in silk and lace. Perfume offered no respite. Extracts distilled from civet cats, ambergris, and exotic resins masked the scent of sweat and illness, but carried its own hazards. A mismeasured drop could suffocate the user or cause convulsions, yet the desire to be noticed, to command the king's gaze, drove women to risk everything. Courtiers spoke of the fainting beauties, those whose obsession with allure led them to collapse mid-dinner, only to be revived by cold water and whispered prayers. In Aldrich's court, survival was inseparable from appearance, and appearance demanded a contract with danger. Even fashion itself was an instrument of peril. Corsets, tight-laced and unforgiving, contorted ribs and organs to sculpt the ideal silhouette. Women fainted from restricted breathing, and those who endured over years risked permanent damage. Cracked ribs, weakened lungs, and compromised digestion. Yet no one dared defy the expectation. To stand upright in a gown without the flattening embrace of a steel-boned corset was to reveal weakness, to invite scorn from peers, and to disappear from the king's attention. Physical pain became a silent currency, traded for fleeting glances and whispered admiration. Among these rituals of destruction, whispers of supernatural remedies swirled. Women drank distilled water from rare herbs to maintain youth, applied secret elixirs to erase blemishes, and even swallowed powdered gemstones to achieve radiance. Many perished quietly, their deaths attributed to delicate constitutions rather than the deadly devotion to beauty. Others survived, their minds dulled by poison, their bodies fragile yet ornate, like porcelain figures poised precariously on the edge of a mantelpiece. Lady Seraphine understood these truths well. She watched, measured, and learned, knowing that to claim the king's favor, she must not only survive the court's intrigue, but endure its rituals of self-inflicted suffering. She applied powders sparingly, tightened her corset only enough to sculpt her frame without succumbing entirely to its pressure, and avoided the most lethal elixirs offered by ambitious attendants eager to prove knowledge of rare substances. Her beauty was deliberate, strategic, a weapon wielded with care. By nightfall, the court was a gallery of spectral figures, pale faces glowing under candlelight, eyes wide and unnervingly bright. Each woman a study in ambition and endurance, each smile hiding pain beneath layers of silk and powder. Aldrich observed them all, discerning the weak from the resilient, the clever from the foolish. Beauty was more than appearance. It was endurance, cunning, and survival under unbearable pressure. And in this deadly theater, Lady Seraphine walked carefully, aware that every glance from the king, every compliment whispered in shadowed corridors, carried the weight of expectation and the silent threat of ruin. To live, to thrive, to be remembered, required mastery not only of charm and grace, but of pain, poison, and patience. In Aldrich's court, beauty was currency, and the price was perilously, unmistakably high. In the dimly lit corridors of Aldrich's castle, whispers traveled faster than torches. Every corner, every tapestry shadowed a secret. Every footstep echoed with rumors that could ruin a life in an instant. Lady Seraphine had learned early that in this court, the loudest voice did not command attention, subtlety did. A glance, a carefully placed word, or a concealed smile could shift alliances, sow distrust, or spark deadly envy. It was a world where words could wound as sharply as a dagger, and the walls themselves seemed to listen. The women of the court were both spectators and participants in this intricate dance of warning. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, passing cautions cloaked as gossip. Beware the queen's chambermaid, she knows too much, or do not smile at the duke. He has eyes in the shadows. Every whispered warning was a survival manual, a way to navigate the invisible snares laid by those who sought power through intrigue. Those who ignored them were often found fainted in the hall, a victim of scandal or subtle poison. Lady Seraphine had encountered her first warning during a banquet. A tray of wine had been presented, its scent familiar, but with a peculiar bitterness that made her lips curl. A quiet nudge from a chambermaid, barely audible over the harpist's strings, alerted her to the danger. Someone had spiked the drink, a subtle reminder that jealousy in the court was as lethal as the sharpest blade. Seraphine smiled, drained the goblet discreetly, and noted the shadows where her enemy lingered. Knowledge, she realized, was survival. Ignorance meant death. But whispers were not always protective. They were instruments of fear. Courtiers spread rumors to manipulate, to test loyalties, to provoke paranoia. One story claimed the king had a hidden chamber lined with mirrors where he watched every action, every furtive glance. Another whispered that he could sense betrayal not just in words, but in the subtle tension of a hand or a shiver of a spine. Whether true or fabricated, such tales created a court where no one trusted their own eyes, where every gesture might betray them. It was a world of shadows masquerading as light, a game in which caution was a shield and suspicion a weapon. Outside the private chambers, servants carried their own secrets. They moved silently, aware that overhearing could be both curse and advantage. One maid whispered to Seraphine of a plot to ruin a rival using tainted perfume laced with a slow-acting poison. Another hinted that a noblewoman had been bribing the castle apothecary for remedies to appear healthier, paler, and more desirable to the king, unaware the concoctions might sicken her. Seraphine recorded these whispers in her mind, cataloged every hint and half-truth. In a court built on appearances, knowledge was the only true armor. Yet the most chilling warnings came not from human mouths, but from tradition itself. The castle had walls thick with history, scrawled warnings in forgotten corridors, faded paintings that seemed to leer with judgment, and tapestries depicting past courtly betrayals. One, in particular, showed a lady seated in lavish dress, her eyes wide with terror as a dagger hovered above her. Beneath, an inscription warned, "Beauty and favor demand vigilance. Neglect invites ruin." Generations had survived by heeding such silent lessons. Ignorance of these echoes meant vanishing into oblivion. Lady Seraphine understood the paradox. To gain favor with Aldrich, one had to remain visible yet invisible, charming yet untouchable, pliant yet cunning. Every smile was calculated, every step measured. Whispers warned her, cautions guided her, and shadows instructed her. Survival required learning the language of danger, recognizing its subtle inflections, and responding before it struck. The smallest error, too eager a laugh, too prolonged a glance, too trusting a hand, could be fatal. And so, as candles guttered in the high halls and the wind whispered through arrow slits, Seraphine moved carefully. She memorized the rumors, noted the subtle warnings, and concealed the knowledge she gained. Every whispered threat, every veiled caution, became a tool in her arsenal. In Aldrich's court, where favor was as fleeting as a shadow and betrayal as sharp as a knife, whispers were both weapons and shields, and those who ignored them vanished without a trace. The court had taught her one undeniable truth. In a world built on perception, shadows spoke louder than any crown. Survival demanded listening, watching, waiting, and when the moment came, acting with ruthless precision. In Aldrich's court, desire was never simple. It was a weapon, a trap, and a throne all at once. The king's attention was as coveted as gold and as dangerous as poison. To catch his eye was to invite both favor and ruin. Those who underestimated the power of his gaze found themselves cast aside, their fortunes vanishing like mist over the castle moat. And yet, the court whispered endlessly of the king's appetites, painting them in shades of horror and fascination. What he desired, he took, not always with violence, but always with certainty. Lady Seraphine had seen it from the first night she arrived. The king, tall and severe, moved through the banquet hall like a shadow made flesh. His eyes swept over the nobles and ladies, lingering for seconds that felt like hours, weighing, judging, calculating. A smile, rare and fleeting, was as potent as a command. Courtiers bowed, whispered, and adjusted every detail of their appearance, knowing that a single misstep, hair out of place, a glove slightly soiled, a dress that failed to catch the light, could turn the king's desire into scorn. Aldrich's favor was a perilous gift. The rumors were brutal. One tale told of a lady who had captured the king's fancy only to be married off to a distant lord the following week, her beauty feared rather than cherished. Another spoke of a noblewoman who had flouted the king's gaze, only to have her wealth confiscated and her home burned. Desire, the court learned, was never neutral. It was either protection or annihilation. Seraphine absorbed these stories like a scholar of survival, cataloging every nuance. She knew that to attract the king's attention was to enter a game in which the stakes were life itself. Yet desire was more than spectacle. It was strategy. Aldrich's needs were capricious but predictable, shaped by his obsessions with control and dominance. He prized loyalty above innocence, cunning above obedience. Ladies who understood his patterns could exploit them, bending his attention towards safety, power, or subtle revenge. Seraphine recognized that a single glance, a carefully timed laugh, or a gesture of humility could shift the king's favor, but misjudged the tempo, and she would become a cautionary tale, whispered in corridors, her beauty erased by fear. The king's desires were also physical, though never simple. The court had long whispered of chambers hidden deep within the castle, where Aldrich summoned those he fancied. Candles flickered along tapestries depicting mythological scenes of seduction and punishment. Soft music played in the background, intended to lull or unnerve. Courtiers spoke of silks and perfumes, of rituals that tested obedience as much as courage. It was said that Aldrich measured both will and fear, delighting in the subtle tension of restraint broken or maintained. Those who failed his tests were returned to the outer halls, humiliated but alive. Those who succeeded gained temporary sanctuary, their influence expanding with every clandestine meeting. Seraphine's first audience was a test. She entered the velvet-draped chamber, her pulse hidden beneath practiced calm. The king's eyes, sharp as obsidian, scanned her form, noting every curve, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion. Words were minimal. Power lived in silence. A single nod, a measured smile, and she passed the first measure of survival. It was a fragile victory, dependent entirely on reading his desires before he spoke them aloud. Outside the chambers, whispers of the king's appetite spread like wildfire. Courtiers speculated endlessly. Who had pleased him? Who had faltered? Who would vanish next? The air was thick with fear, envy, and anticipation. Those who had once wielded influence could find themselves reduced to shadows in the hall. Those who moved carefully, like Seraphine, learned that desire was a tool, one to manipulate, one to placate, one to endure. By the week's end, Seraphine understood the truth. Aldrich's desire was never just personal. It was political, psychological, and devastatingly strategic. Those who could wield it, or survive it, rose. Those who ignored it fell. The king's desire shaped the court as surely as any edict, bending the fates of women, men, and even noble houses. In this game, desire was both blade and shield, and only those who mastered it would see another sunrise in Aldrich's shadow. The castle halls reeked of roasted meat and melted fat, but the stench was only half the horror. Tonight, Aldrich's banquet was more than a meal. It was a spectacle of power, desire, and subtle terror. Nobles and ladies gathered under glittering chandeliers, their laughter brittle as bones, their smiles careful masks over raw apprehension. No one ate freely. Every bite, every sip, was measured against the invisible weight of the king's gaze. In Aldrich's court, gluttony was a test, and indulgence was a gamble. The feast began with the arrival of the first courses. Venison roasted over open flame, its juices dripping into ornate silver platters. Pheasant stuffed with herbs that had killed lesser men when misused. Boar so tender it seemed to melt under the touch of knives, yet spiced with subtle poisons to remind guests that pleasure and peril were inseparable. Servants moved like ghosts, carrying trays with trembling hands, knowing that a single misstep, a dropped fork, a misplaced goblet, could draw the king's ire and ruin a family overnight. Aldrich sat at the high table, his presence a dark sun around which the court orbited. His eyes, black and assessing, skimmed every movement, cataloging weakness, arrogance, and beauty alike. He reached for a piece of boar, cutting it with deliberate slowness, tasting, nodding. That single gesture, so mundane to the untrained eye, dictated the fortune of all who watched. A lady smiled too broadly, her teeth showing in a gleam that caught the candlelight. The king's frown was subtle, but deadly. A lord reached too greedily for a goblet. A sharp cough from Aldrich froze his hand midair. Every detail of behavior was under scrutiny. The conversation was equally perilous. Courtiers spoke in riddles, praising the king while masking ambition. Some discussed distant politics. Others veiled threats under the guise of compliments. Aldrich listened, smiling rarely, nodding only when it served his purpose. His words, when they came, were decisive. He could elevate a family to immense wealth, or consign them to ruin with a single sentence. The feast was less about food than about spectacle, a demonstration that nothing in the castle existed beyond his control. Amid the pageantry, the most terrifying element of the evening was the king's appetite, both literal and metaphorical. Stories whispered of meals where Aldrich forced rivals to eat from the same plate, spiced with herbs that loosened the tongue or clouded the mind. Those who ate too quickly choked, those who ate too slowly were humiliated. A subtle poison, administered in a careless moment, could render a guest sick, delirious, or dead within hours. It was not mere cruelty. It was power manifested in taste, texture, and timing. By the third course, the air was thick with the combined heat of fire and fear. Candles flickered against the high stone walls, casting shadows that seemed almost alive. Servants offered wine in crystal goblets, and nobles raised their glasses with trembling hands. The liquid was sweet, dark, and dangerously potent. Some whispered it contained ground hallucinogenic herbs, intended to heighten the senses or loosen confessions. Every sip was a negotiation with fate, every bite a gamble with mortality. At the center of the hall, a table displayed the pièce de résistance, a whole boar, its head crowned with an apple, its body stuffed with nuts, fruits, and spices that spoke of exotic lands and hidden dangers. It was a symbol of the king's dominion, a grotesque monument to his appetite for control. Guests leaned forward, drawn by both hunger and terror, knowing that indulgence could be rewarded with a nod, or punished with exile, scandal, or death. Aldrich carved slowly, savoring the anticipation, letting the knife linger on the tenderest cuts. Lady Seraphine observed from the corner, noting every glance, every shiver, every subtle shift in posture. She had learned that survival in Aldrich's court depended on understanding the unspoken rules: who could be appeased, who could be manipulated, and who must be feared. The feast of flesh was more than a meal. It was a mirror of the court itself, seductive, dangerous, and brutal. By night's end, those who left the hall unscathed were rare, and those who had gained the king's favor were fewer still. Desire, hunger, and fear blended into a potent cocktail, and only the cunning could drink deeply without spilling blood. The royal decree arrived at midnight, delivered by a trembling courier whose horse snorted through the frozen castle courtyard. In the flickering candlelight of the main hall, the herald unrolled the scroll and read aloud, voice quivering. By the command of His Majesty, every household of the realm shall present its finest servants for inspection. Failure to comply shall be considered treason. The courtiers stiffened. Whispers rose like smoke in the cold air, weaving through the high arches of stone. No one dared speak against the king. Doing so meant disappearance, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal. Lady Seraphine clutched the summons, her knuckles white beneath embroidered gloves. She had navigated the court for years, her beauty and charm shielding her from gossip and envy. Yet now, even those qualities offered no comfort. Stories of vanished nobles haunted the corridors. The chambermaid who hummed too loudly, the page whose bowing seemed too eager, the musician whose lute had dared to slip a sharp note. All were gone, swept away without trace, their absence explained as sudden illness or mysterious travel. Survival here demanded vigilance sharper than any sword. By dawn, inspectors arrived, dressed entirely in black, faces hidden behind iron masks. They moved silently through the castle, testing, questioning, observing. A hesitation, a misstep, a tremor in the voice, enough to mark one for removal. Seraphine watched a young page falter under their scrutiny, his eyes widening in terror. Moments later, he was gone. The room seemed emptier, the shadows longer, the air heavier. Nobody returned to confirm what happened to those taken, and that uncertainty was worse than the truth. The king's orders were not merely bureaucratic. They were performative, almost ritualistic. Servants and courtiers alike were to display obedience, grace, and perfection. Every smile, every gesture, every word measured. Misjudged a bow, and the consequences were swift. Misread the king's gaze, and you vanished. Yet for those who survived, rewards were granted: favor, protection, influence, always at an unknowable cost. Lady Seraphine realized that survival required more than compliance. It demanded an understanding of the invisible rules that bound the court, the shadow of the throne under which everyone labored. By mid-morning, she had been summoned to the private chambers. Her heartbeat quickened with fear and anticipation. Tales of what happened inside were whispered in the halls. Tongues cut for insolence, weeks of confinement in dark, damp cells. Women returned hollowed and trembling, their spirits broken, yet granted an inexplicable favor. Some emerged as confidantes of the king, wielding influence that others could only dream of, but no one spoke of the price. Seraphine descended the spiral staircase, each step echoing like a drumbeat of doom. The tapestries lining the walls, depicting battles and feasts, seemed to leer with judgmental eyes. The guards flanking the chamber doors were statues of menace, hands resting lightly on blades that had tasted blood too many times. The air was thick, every heartbeat amplified, every breath a gamble. Courtiers passed her with bowed heads, faces pale, each carrying the knowledge that the king's favor was fleeting, his wrath eternal. Entering the throne room, Seraphine felt the king's gaze strike her like a physical force. It swept the chamber, measuring, weighing, calculating. One wrong expression, one misstep in posture or tone, and she would disappear as silently as the others. Yet she sensed that survival required more than obedience. It demanded anticipation, a merging with the shadow that trailed the throne. To bend without breaking, to obey without question, to understand desires unspoken and dangers unimagined, these were the unrecorded lessons of the court. The herald stepped back, the scroll now limp in his hands. Silence enveloped the room, as if the stone walls themselves awaited the king's next command. Seraphine, chest tight, understood the cruel paradox. The king's orders were absolute, yet their execution demanded intuition, cunning, and nerve beyond measure. Failure meant disappearance. Compliance demanded sacrifice, often unseen and unspoken. The shadow of the throne stretched long, and to walk beneath it was to accept that life and favor were inseparable from fear, manipulation, and unrelenting scrutiny. Seraphine took a slow breath, forcing calm into her limbs. The king had spoken. The game was set, and the only way forward was to move within the shadow, unnoticed yet ever watchful, prepared to survive the caprices of a ruler whose power could erase existence itself. The castle was alive with anxious motion. Servants scurried through the halls, carrying trays of wine, stacks of embroidered linens, and bundles of fragrant herbs meant to mask the scent of human sweat and fear. The king's announcement had spread like wildfire. A performance was to be held in the great hall, one that would entertain and terrify in equal measure. Every detail had to be perfect, every gesture measured. Failure was unthinkable. Lady Seraphine observed the chaos from behind a tapestry, her fingers gripping the delicate fabric. She had been summoned to participate in the performance, though the nature of it remained deliberately vague. Courtiers whispered that it was both spectacle and punishment, a demonstration of the king's power and the consequences of defiance. Those who had performed before her emerged pale, speaking in halting tones of the terrifying precision demanded. The costumes, the music, the timing, even the angle of a glance could determine survival or disappearance. In her chambers, Seraphine's attendants prepared her attire. Layers of velvet and silk were heaped upon the bed, embroidered with threads of gold that caught the flickering candlelight. The fabrics were beautiful, yet suffocating, and beneath them lay the hidden instruments of discomfort, tight corsets that constricted the lungs, jeweled collars that pressed against her throat, and weighted slippers that made every step a careful calculation. Beauty was demanded, yet it was weaponized, an instrument of control. Pain and grace were inseparable. The makeup alone was a ritual. Women of the court used powders mixed with lead to achieve the pale, ethereal skin the king demanded. Lips painted a muted crimson that concealed the natural flush of blood and fear. Seraphine's attendants applied it with precision, warning that a smudge could be taken as disrespect. Eyebrows were drawn to perfection, eyes lined to create the illusion of alertness, innocence, or intrigue, depending on the king's whims. Every mark, every shade, was a potential life or death decision. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above. The sound was deliberately discordant, strings pulled taut to squeal at the edge of human comfort, drums pounding like a heartbeat that belonged to the castle itself. Servants tested torches, ensuring they would not extinguish mid-performance. Every sound, every flicker of light was meant to unsettle, to remind both performers and audience that they were under scrutiny, that any misstep could unravel existence itself. The performers were briefed in hushed tones, their instructions laced with fear. "Move slowly," an attendant whispered. "Do not meet his eyes until commanded. Keep the gestures exact." The king notices everything. Seraphine felt the weight of centuries of tradition pressing on her chest. Lessons unspoken, punishments unrecorded, favors granted at a price that no one dared name. Survival demanded more than obedience. It demanded instinct, courage, and the capacity to anticipate a ruler who seemed to delight in unpredictability. In the hour before the king arrived, the great hall transformed into a stage of both spectacle and terror. Heavy tapestries were drawn, candles lit, and banners of the royal crest unfurled. The air smelled of wax, oil, and the faint trace of human fear that lingered in stone walls after decades of tyranny. Seraphine stepped into the hall, her slippers clicking lightly against the marble. Each step was deliberate, rehearsed, a dance of survival. She felt the eyes of the king on her even before he appeared, a phantom presence that set her pulse racing and her mind sharpening. When the doors opened, the king's shadow filled the hall. The courtiers froze, their faces masks of practiced civility. Servants and performers alike swallowed the rising panic that threatened to choke them. The king walked with measured steps, each one echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. Seraphine understood instinctively. The performance was not only for amusement. It was a test, a means of asserting control, a way to remind every person in the castle that their lives and fates were inseparable from his whims. The music began, low and discordant, vibrating through the stone floors. Torches flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters along the walls. Seraphine took her position, spine straight, breath controlled, face pale yet composed. Every fiber of her being was poised for survival, attuned to the smallest shift in the king's attention. This was not merely performance. It was preparation, rehearsal, and anticipation all at once, a delicate balancing act on the knife edge of life and death. Night fell over the castle like a shroud, heavy with expectation and the lingering scent of candle smoke. Torches flared along the walls, flickering shadows that seemed alive, stretching into corners where fear had already taken residence. Lady Seraphine sat in her chamber, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the folds of her gown. This was her first night performing before the king, the first time she would step into a ritual that blurred entertainment, obedience, and survival into one merciless act. The servants moved silently, carrying trays of spiced wine and sweetmeats, their faces pale and eyes averted. Whispers passed between them, tales of those who had faltered on their first night and vanished from the castle without explanation. Some spoke of falling ill after a single misstep. Others murmured of fainting from terror, only to awake days later in strange chambers. Changed somehow, their expressions hollow. Seraphine swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. Fear was a tool, and tonight she could not afford weakness. The great hall had transformed again. Tapestries were drawn tighter, obscuring the flicker of moonlight. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting elongated shadows that crept like serpents along the cold stone floor. The musicians were stationed above in the gallery, strings tuned to produce shrill tones that clawed at the nerves, drums thudding in unrelenting rhythms. Every sound seemed designed to unbalance the mind, to remind performers that the hall was not a stage alone but a trap, and the audience, the king, was both judge and executioner. Seraphine stepped into the hall, her slippers whispering against the marble, each step deliberate, rehearsed. The other performers moved in synchrony, faces masks of beauty and tension. They were all acutely aware of the ritualistic gaze awaiting them. No one dared make the smallest misstep, no gesture too fast or too slow. Each movement had been drilled into them for weeks, gestures of greeting, bows of submission, flicks of the wrist that implied both innocence and cunning. Tonight, the king would notice everything. The doors at the far end opened with a slow, ominous groan. The king entered, flanked by guards whose armor gleamed in torchlight. Silence fell immediately, a weight pressing against the chest. The courtiers froze in place, their perfumed garments suffocating in the tension. Seraphine felt the king's gaze pierce her, as if measuring not just her obedience, but the very essence of her being. It was a gaze she would remember for the rest of her life, a cold, calculating presence that devoured confidence and left only instinct. The performance began with a delicate flourish of music, discordant yet mesmerizing, sending tremors through the floor and into the performers' spines. Seraphine moved as instructed, a slow, precise dance that balanced elegance and restraint. Every gesture, raising a hand, tilting her head, shifting weight from one foot to the other, was executed with meticulous care. Behind her, a torch sputtered, sending shadows racing across the walls, mimicking the trembling of her own heart. Minutes stretched like hours. Every glance from the king was a test, a probe into composure, obedience, and fear. Some performers faltered, their lips trembling or eyes flicking too long toward the gallery. The king's lips curved in what could only be described as amusement, or was it disdain? No one could tell. Seraphine kept her gaze lowered, face pale, smile restrained. She felt as though each heartbeat might echo through the hall, exposing her in ways the music and torches could not. A sudden shift in the king's attention snapped her nerves taut. He raised a hand, and the performers froze mid-motion, caught like birds in a snare. One misstep could undo everything. Seraphine held her breath, muscles coiled, sensing that this night was more than spectacle, it was a proving ground. Those who faltered risked more than humiliation. Some whispered it was their very survival at stake. When the performance ended, silence hung for a heartbeat before the hall exhaled in relief. The king had not moved to punish, had not singled anyone out, yet the tension did not dissipate. Seraphine knew this was only the beginning. The first night was a baptism of fear, a ritual that would be repeated, each performance sharpening control, obedience, and terror. She walked from the hall with careful steps, aware that each flicker of torchlight, every whispered warning, had been a lesson. This was the life she had entered, a life where beauty, fear, and survival were inseparable. The castle archives smelled of dust, parchment, and time so old it seemed to have hardened into the walls themselves. Lady Seraphine's footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors, muffled by thick tapestries. Tonight, she was not performing for the king. Tonight, she was a witness to the machinery that ensured his will persisted long after the thrill of the hall had faded. Documents, records, and testimonies, some meticulously kept, others scribbled in trembling ink, lay before her like fragments of forgotten lives. The clerks and scribes moved with practiced precision, each aware that their work was both sacred and terrifying. Errors were rarely forgiven. One misplaced phrase, one misdated entry could ruin careers or lives. Seraphine observed in silence as the scribes cataloged the names of those summoned, punished, or rewarded. Each parchment bore witness to acts that had been committed in the shadow of the throne, acts that never reached the ears of the common folk, but shaped their fates just the same. She traced a finger over an old vellum, the ink faded but legible, a list of women summoned to perform for the king, dates and times of arrival carefully noted. Some entries were crossed out, a single word, eliminated, written beside the name. It was chilling, the economy of death reduced to a single word, as if a life could be dismissed with the stroke of a pen. Seraphine shivered. The first night had been harrowing, but these documents revealed the true machinery behind the spectacle, an invisible network of obedience, fear, and meticulous record-keeping that ensured the king's desires were absolute. A scribe looked up, eyes wary. "You should not linger too long," he whispered. "The king likes discretion in those who witness his power." Seraphine nodded, aware that curiosity was dangerous, but also necessary. To survive, one had to know the shape of the forces pressing in from every side. She bent closer to a pile of testimonies, ink smudged from years of handling, revealing confessions extracted under varying degrees of duress. Some were simple complaints about illnesses or accidents, others detailed moments of betrayal, real or imagined. Yet all bore the unmistakable imprint of fear, their authors aware that one false word could mean ruin. The room was silent, except for the scratching of quills, punctuated by the occasional creak of wooden floors. Seraphine read the account of a maid accused of attempting to warn a performer about the king's temper. Her confession was brief. "I spoke, I erred, I am guilty." No plea for mercy, no attempt at justification, only acknowledgement of the king's omnipresence. Seraphine felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. The king's power extended beyond the hall, beyond the stages and dances, into every word, every gesture, and every note recorded by his scribes. Another document caught her attention, a ledger of gifts, bribes, and favors distributed to those who pleased him. Jewelry, coin, rare fabrics, material tokens of survival, each tied to obedience and discretion. The ledger was almost cheerful in its precision, a strange contrast to the fear it represented. Every reward was a reminder that the king's desire was both terrifying and transactional. Compliance brought luxury, defiance, ruin. Seraphine felt herself caught in the balance, realizing that each step she had taken in the hall had been watched, catalogued, and judged. Footsteps approached, and Seraphine quickly straightened, heart hammering. A senior clerk entered, robes brushing the floor, eyes sharp beneath a furrowed brow. "Remember," he said, voice low, "the ink carries memory. The walls carry memory. You may think the night ends with the candles, but it does not. What is written is eternal." His gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken warnings. As the clerk retreated, Seraphine returned to the papers, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. Witnessing the king's empire of documents was like glimpsing the skeleton beneath the flesh of the castle, a cold, exacting framework that dictated the lives of those who lived under his shadow. Names, dates, judgments, bribes, and confessions intertwined to create a map of obedience, fear, and the subtle machinery of power. By the time Seraphine left the archives, the candles had burned low, and the corridors seemed darker, colder, more oppressive. She understood, more fully than ever, that survival required more than beauty or talent. It required vigilance, comprehension, and the careful navigation of written and unwritten laws. Every night of performance, every whispered instruction, every bow before the king was recorded, remembered, and enforced. And in this meticulous web of paper and ink, the shadow of the throne reached further than any torchlight could penetrate. The morning air was thick with tension, the kind that made soldiers glance nervously at one another, hands twitching toward swords that would soon taste blood. Word had come down from the palace that the king demanded a demonstration, not of loyalty, but of obedience. The army, once a symbol of pride and protection, was now a theater for terror. Officers whispered in corridors, calculating how far they could bend before breaking, while the rank and file shuffled into formation, unsure if they were preparing for war or execution. Captain Alaric, a veteran of campaigns no one remembered, felt a chill creep up his spine. He had seen men die for less, for causes they could not name. But this spectacle of power was something different. Orders from the throne had a peculiar precision. Never question, never hesitate, never doubt. And yet, as he inspected his men, he recognized the same flicker of fear in their eyes he saw in his own reflection. Fear, he realized, was the king's weapon, sharper than any blade. The courtyard was alive with anticipation. Soldiers polished armor until it gleamed like silver mirrors, and the banners, each embroidered with the royal crest, fluttered stiffly in the morning wind. Onlookers from the city had been allowed in, a rare concession. They lined the walls, murmuring nervously as if the act they were about to witness was both forbidden and essential. Children clung to mothers' skirts, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The king would be watching from his balcony, a silent predator among his prey. Drums echoed, low and deliberate, setting the pace for the approaching parade. Alaric's regiment marched in formation, boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, as though the stones themselves remembered every rebellion crushed, every soldier who had faltered and paid with his life. At the front of the courtyard, a platform had been erected. From it, a herald read aloud the king's decree: obedience in action, loyalty proven through service, and disobedience punished with an example carved in flesh. The soldiers carried out maneuvers with mechanical precision, the hours of drilling manifesting in perfect lines and coordinated turns. Yet in each movement, Alaric saw a subtle tremor, a hesitation masked by discipline. He knew that under different circumstances, these same men might have laughed, sung, or fought with honor. Now, the same muscles that once wielded swords against enemies were prisoners to a tyrant's gaze. Every salute, every pivot, every stomp of a boot was a testament not to skill, but to survival. At noon, the king signaled a halt. Silence fell, dense and suffocating. Alaric's eyes met those of his lieutenant, and he could read the question in the unspoken line: how far will this go? The king's shadow loomed larger than the midday sun. his presence an oppressive force that made the air tremble. One soldier, inexperienced and trembling, dropped his spear. The crowd gasped. The king's gaze sharpened, dissecting the error, and the punishment was immediate. A swift lash across the back reminded everyone why mistakes were more than missteps. They were invitations to death. The remainder of the demonstration turned into a study of fear's anatomy. Soldiers executed complex drills with a rigidity that bordered on the grotesque. Any deviation invited scrutiny. Any sign of humanity was a weakness to be exploited. Alaric's mind wandered to the families left behind, the letters unread, the promises broken. He understood painfully that the army had become not a protector of the realm, but an instrument of spectacle, each man a puppet whose strings were pulled by a monarch's whim. By evening, the courtyard was a theater of exhaustion. Soldiers slumped where they stood, shields clattering to the stones, armor dented and smeared with dust. The king departed without a word, leaving behind a silence heavier than any command. Alaric walked among his men, offering quiet reassurance where he could, but even his voice sounded hollow in the shadow of tyranny. They had survived the king's test, but at what cost? Pride had been replaced with caution, courage with calculation, and in that cost, Alaric recognized a truth he could not shake. The army, once a symbol of strength, now lived only in fear of its master. Night fell, and the soldiers returned to their barracks, bodies weary, minds restless. Outside, the city whispered of the day's events, stories growing more grotesque with each retelling. Within the walls of the palace, the king smiled, satisfied. His army had performed admirably, yes, but more importantly, they had learned the lesson he prized above all. Obedience was eternal, and the cost of defiance absolute. The council chamber smelled of cold stone and extinguished torches. Shadows flickered across the walls, bending the faces of the advisors into grotesque masks of fear and ambition. In this room, survival was measured not in valor, but in calculation, timing, and the ruthless mastery of appearances. One misstep, a glance too long, a word misplaced, could erase a life or undo months of careful maneuvering. Lady Ellis sat near the back, observing. She had learned to read the language of survival, the subtle twitch of a lip, the faint tightening of a jaw, the way a man's eyes shifted when he concealed more than he revealed. Every motion in this room carried weight. Every pause, every hesitation could be fatal. The king's favor was as elusive as it was absolute, and those who failed to perceive the unspoken rules vanished quietly, leaving only whispers and empty chairs. The king had not yet arrived, and the room trembled with anticipation. Advisors straightened robes, whispered reassurances, and adjusted their posture, wary of betraying impatience. A servant appeared at the door with news. Minor disturbances in the city had been suppressed with a swiftness that suggested more than mere authority. Rumors spread faster than the king's temper, and each tidbit could either safeguard or condemn. Elis stored every detail, calculating its weight, imagining how it might shift alliances or provoke suspicion. When the king entered, silence fell abruptly, as though the air itself had been cut away. His shadow stretched across the floor, swallowing light, and every head bowed instinctively. Eyes dared only fleeting contact. One glance from him could expose hidden fear. One tilt of his head could punish the unworthy. Elis centered herself, recalling months of study, every cadence of his speech, every twitch that hinted at mercy or malice. She noted the subtle rhythm of his breathing, the way his fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against the armrest. These small gestures, easily overlooked, often foretold the storm to come. The council moved into discussion. Superficially, it concerned supply lines and patrols. Beneath, it was a game of psychological chess. Each proposal carried consequences far beyond the surface. One advisor suggested raising taxes, and the room froze. Another proposed sending troops to a border province, enough to please the king, yet not enough to hint at defiance. Elis spoke softly, offering a strategy that seemed cautious but subtly protected weaker provinces. She watched the king's expression, noting the brief flicker of approval masked immediately by his habitual frown. Outside, messengers and spies drifted through corridors like ghosts. Knowledge was survival, but power always cut both ways. To reveal too much invited envy and suspicion. To reveal too little risked dismissal or death. The tension was sharp, addictive, a far more exacting trial than any battlefield. Every whispered rumor, every veiled threat, could shift the balance. By mid-afternoon, tentative agreements were reached. No fanfare marked success, only quiet nods, cautious smiles, and careful restraint. The king dismissed them with a wave, his face unreadable. Advisors left, moving like shadows, acutely aware that survival depended on invisible alignments and unspoken rules. Elis lingered, examining maps, routes, and fortresses. Strategy extended beyond armies. Alliances, rumors, and diversions were all instruments of influence. The king wielded the sword. She wielded foresight. Her calculations shifted the currents of power in ways invisible to the less perceptive. She imagined possible betrayals, secret alliances, and the ripple effects of decisions made in haste or under duress. As dusk fell, torches cast long shadows across the castle's cold stones. Elis walked alone, reflecting on survival as a daily performance. Friends had disappeared overnight, replaced by whispers and hollow seats. Each choice carried weight, each word a thread in a fragile web, yet she was alive. In the king's shadow, Elis had learned a fundamental truth. Survival depended on patience, perception, and precision. The night deepened, the stones cold beneath her fingertips, and she prepared for the next day, knowing that every shadow could conceal a knife, every whispered rumor could alter fate, and every small decision might determine life or death. The council's lessons, the king's temper, the city's unrest, all were instruments she had to master, if only to endure another day. The castle corridors smelled of sweat, wax, and the faint tang of blood. Torches flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. No one slept, or at least, not properly. Every step echoed in the halls as servants hurried, their faces pale, eyes hollow. Exhaustion was not a curse, it was the currency of survival. To falter for a single heartbeat could mean humiliation, punishment, or disappearance. Lady Elis moved carefully, her feet silent on the cold stone. Nights in the castle were always the hardest. During the day, one could hide behind documents, strategies, and the king's attention. At night, those masks fell away. Whispers traveled faster than light, and every shadow could conceal an enemy or a trap. She had learned to pace herself, to measure her energy as meticulously as she measured her words. Even fatigue could betray weakness, and weakness here was lethal. The king's presence, or rather, the expectation of his presence, was constant. Courtiers, soldiers, and advisors alike carried an invisible weight, a nervous tension that never eased. Elis had seen men collapse at their desks from sleeplessness, women retreat into corners to quiet their racing hearts. Exhaustion didn't kill directly, but it sharpened mistakes, made judgment slip, and invited disaster. She herself had walked the thin line between alertness and collapse countless times, heart pounding, hands shaking, yet never allowing herself to falter. The day's council had been a trial of endurance. Hours spent debating supply lines, troop movements, and rumors of rebellion had left everyone mentally drained. Elis, however, thrived in this chaos. Her mind, trained in observation and calculation, did not tire so easily. She memorized every gesture, every flicker of expression, cataloging loyalties and potential betrayals. Others might sleep to restore their bodies. She fed her strategy on sleeplessness, drawing strength from the patterns others overlooked. Outside the council chambers, the city pulsed with unrest. Soldiers patrolled unevenly, their armor clanking in the night air, while messengers darted between gates with fragments of news. Fires burned low in the streets, their smoke curling into the sky, carrying both warmth and danger. Citizens whispered of strange disappearances, of soldiers taking more than just taxes, of the king's gaze settling on houses like a predator. Exhaustion extended beyond the castle walls. It seeped into the city, threading through streets, homes, and markets. Survival was collective, yet deeply personal. In the inner chambers, Elis paused to examine a map spread across a table. Her eyes traced every road, every river crossing, every outpost that could be exploited or defended. She noted patterns in troop rotations and the allocation of resources. Even when the body demanded rest, her mind pressed on. She calculated contingencies, imagining the king's reaction to each possible scenario. Fatigue threatened, but she welcomed it as a proving ground. Endurance was not just physical, it was mental, moral, and strategic. A faint noise startled her. The servants moved like ghosts in the corridors, but one clinked a chain, a sound amplified in the emptiness. She froze, heart hammering, then breathed slowly. Training and instinct combined. She was a shadow among shadows, blending into the stone and flame. This was the essence of endurance, composure under constant threat, the ability to act while the body begged surrender. By the early hours, exhaustion reached its apex. Advisors slumped in chairs, soldiers dozed leaning on walls, and servants whispered apologies for their delays. Yet Elis remained, silent, observing. She understood a cruel truth. The king rewarded stamina, not brilliance alone. Those who could endure longest, who could withstand hunger, fear, and sleeplessness without breaking, were the ones who survived. Knowledge, courage, and loyalty mattered, but endurance dictated who thrived and who perished. As dawn approached, a faint light crept over the ramparts, brushing the castle stones with gray. Shadows shrank, but tension remained, a silent reminder that the day would bring fresh trials. Elis finally allowed herself a small stretch, muscles stiff from hours of silent vigilance. Survival had demanded everything, body, mind, and spirit. And yet, she was still here. She had endured. In the king's shadow, endurance was the ultimate weapon. It was sharper than any sword, subtler than any scheme, more revealing than any confession. The castle, silent and expectant, bore witness to her triumph, a quiet testament to the power of survival in a world where exhaustion was both enemy and ally. And in that fragile victory, Elis understood that the trials of night were but preparation for the storm that awaited at first light. The morning air sliced through the courtyard like a cold blade, carrying the acrid smoke from last night's torches and the distant tang of the river. Soldiers moved in rigid formations, boots striking stone in a relentless rhythm, armor clinking like the cadence of obedience. Every gaze met the king's and recoiled, every posture adjusted, subtle but deliberate. Today was not just another inspection. The fragile hierarchy of the court, the invisible threads of power, were about to snap, and even the slightest misstep could be fatal. Lady Elis observed from the gallery, cloak drawn tight, eyes scanning every figure below. She had memorized the routines, tracked the whispers that passed between advisors, and followed the invisible currents of loyalty and deceit. For weeks, subtle shifts had hinted at a looming change. Glances exchanged in shadowed corridors, alliances forming behind closed doors, secrets mutating into leverage. Today, every movement could determine who endured and who vanished into obscurity, leaving only whispered stories and empty chairs in their wake. The king began his inspection, strides slow and deliberate. Soldiers stiffened, gripping weapons, muscles taut beneath polished armor. Advisors shuffled papers, feigning composure, while their hearts raced beneath silk and velvet. The castle itself seemed to inhale, corridors and stone walls straining with anticipation, as if aware of the storm about to sweep through. Tension was palpable, curling around the stomachs of all present, tightening like a vice. Every eye flicked nervously, measuring loyalty, gauging threats, seeking any sign of weakness in a room that demanded perfection. A sudden shout shattered the brittle calm. A messenger burst into the courtyard, parchment clutched tightly, eyes wide with urgency. The king took it without ceremony. Whispers rippled instantly, subtle but electric. Elis's pulse quickened. She knew the significance. This parchment carried more than news. It carried opportunity. One revelation, One secret exposed could topple careers, fracture loyalties, crown unexpected favorites. The turning point had arrived, invisible yet absolute, and its effects would ripple through the castle like a sudden deadly wind. The king unfurled the note. His eyes scanned the contents with predatory precision, and for a heartbeat, a flicker of recognition betrayed him. Advisors stiffened, glances darting, lips pressed into thin lines. The equilibrium of the court shifted imperceptibly, but irrevocably. Whispers hardened into statements, loyalties fractured or aligned anew, and the castle seemed to shiver under the pressure of invisible currents, stone and torchlight trembling as if aware of the shift. Elis descended the gallery silently, noting every reaction. A senior advisor's hand trembled despite his practiced composure. A young knight, newly appointed, stood rigid, armor glinting, oblivious that his overzealous obedience had made him vulnerable. Information, Elis reminded herself, was the deadliest weapon. The king wielded authority openly. She wielded it quietly, invisibly, in the space between observation and action, threading influence through whispers and subtle gestures. By midday, consequences solidified. Commands reshaped troop movements, reassigned responsibilities, and subtly redistributed influence among courtiers. Some gained advantage. Others felt their power dissolve like smoke. The king maintained his air of impervious control, orchestrating adjustments with the precision of a predator. Yet Elis noted the tiny cracks, hesitations, micro-expressions, glimpses of indecision that could be exploited. Even absolute power was not immune to pressure, error, or manipulation. Evening fell, shadows stretching across the courtyard. The air, once taut with anticipation, now hummed with aftermath. Advisors retreated to recalibrate strategies. Soldiers returned to barracks, muscles still trembling from sudden exertions. Courtiers whispered in corners, reassessing loyalties and alliances. Elis lingered in the fading light, allowing herself the smallest measure of satisfaction. Her instincts had been correct. Observation, patience, and the careful reading of human nature shaped outcomes as effectively as any blade. In the king's shadow, the turning point was not a single event, but a lesson. Survival required vigilance, cunning, and the ability to act when the balance shifted. By nightfall, the castle had changed, though few noticed. Elis knew tomorrow would bring new calculations, fresh trials, and renewed tests of endurance. But for now, she breathed, poised and unbroken. The corridors whispered secrets. Torches flickered with renewed purpose. The king, unaware of the subtle chaos now threading through his court, retired to his chambers. And in the quiet, Lady Elis allowed herself a small, cold smile. Survival had always favored those who saw the storm before it struck, and who moved with it, rather than against it, bending shadows to their will before the dawn. The first chill of dawn crept across the castle walls, carrying a quiet promise of reckoning. Lady Elis moved through the corridors with deliberate calm, her cloak brushing the stone like a shadow's whisper. The events of the turning point had left cracks in the court's veneer, fissures she intended to widen. Those who had wronged her, underestimated her, or flaunted their privilege would learn, in slow, deliberate fashion, that patience could be deadlier than the sword. The court, still reeling from the day's upheaval, offered openings where once there had been rigid hierarchies. Allies could be courted, enemies baited, and secrets wielded like knives. Elis's mind danced across the possibilities, each step mapped with precision. Revenge was not to be rushed. It was to be executed with the elegance of inevitability, a quiet undoing that left its victims gasping in disbelief. Every whispered confession, every misdelivered message, could be turned to advantage. In the council chamber, a meeting convened under the guise of routine administration. Elis observed the players. The once proud advisor whose words now faltered, the young knight puffed up with unearned confidence, the murmuring servants who knew more than they dared to speak. Each held a thread that, if pulled correctly, could unravel plans, reputations, and alliances alike. She did not act immediately. She waited, letting the current of fear and overconfidence draw others into her carefully laid trap. The king remained an ever-present specter, his gaze both omniscient and unpredictable. Power, as Elis had long understood, was a living thing, fragile, corruptible, and ultimately dependent on the obedience of others. She could not defy him openly. She could, however, manipulate the environment around him, redirecting attention, planting suggestions, and allowing consequences to unfold organically. Every move was a dance, every pause a calculated measure of suspense. By midday, subtle maneuvers had shifted the balance further. Allies received confidential information, innocuous in appearance, but laced with implication. Enemies received faint hints of exposure, a whisper here, a glance there, enough to fray nerves and sow doubt. Elis's satisfaction grew quietly. She did not relish cruelty for its own sake, but the precision of justice and the inevitability of it was intoxicating. Every carefully timed action served a dual purpose: survival and reclamation. The castle itself seemed to participate in her design. Corridors funneled movement predictably, shadows offered concealment, and the ever-present eyes of servants, courtiers, and guards became instruments in her orchestration. No action was wasted, no glance unmeasured. By evening, the first tangible effects appeared. A bold advisor faltered in public, a secret alliance fractured, and whispers of loyalty shifted subtly toward Elis's emerging network. Revenge, she realized, was not always explosive. It could be a patient erosion, a silent reclamation of power. Dinner brought the final act. The king observed the proceedings with his usual scrutiny, unaware of the shifting undercurrents. Elis positioned herself strategically, listening, responding, subtly guiding conversation. Her influence, imperceptible to all but the most attuned, redirected the evening's outcomes. Alliances hardened where she wished, vulnerabilities were exposed without detection, and the weight of her presence settled like a quiet fog over the room. By nightfall, the castle had been reshaped in small but significant ways. Those who had underestimated her now trembled at the implications of their own actions. Allies knew the value of her favor and moved cautiously to secure it. Elis, alone in her chambers, allowed herself a moment to exhale, her mind already calculating the next steps. Survival had brought her this far, but mastery, the reclamation of influence and the quiet execution of revenge, was hers to command. Outside, the torches flickered, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the courtyard. The king, still unaware of the subtleties at play, retired to his chambers, leaving the stage set for Elis's continued rise. In the quiet, she smiled, cold and precise. Revenge was not merely an act, it was a performance, and she, at last, had taken control of the script. In the king's shadow, reclamation was both art and necessity. One misstep could undo everything, but one deliberate movement could shift the tides of power irrevocably. Lady Elis understood this fully. Patience, calculation, and the subtle orchestration of every human instinct were weapons sharper than any sword, and she wielded them flawlessly. The dawn light crept through the high windows of the castle, casting long, pale rectangles across stone floors, worn smooth by decades of power and deceit. Lady Elis moved through the halls with deliberate slowness, each step measured, each glance calculated. The court had changed, though the king remained imperious, unaware of how deeply her influence had woven through every thread of governance and loyalty. The legacy of a king's favorite, she reflected, was rarely about charm. It was about survival, cunning, and mastery of perception. Years of maneuvering, observation, and patience had brought her to this precipice. Allies were now instruments of subtle control, enemies neutralized by whispers, misplaced documents, and carefully timed revelations. Yet the ultimate test remained, maintaining favor in a court built upon envy, suspicion, and the ever-present threat of sudden execution. To endure was not enough. She had to define her legacy before the king's shadow faded, leaving her vulnerable to the next ambitious courtier. The king entered the council chamber as if carved from stone, his gaze sharp and commanding. Advisors straightened, Courtiers faltered, and servants held their breath. Elis allowed herself a brief smile, hidden beneath a mask of composure. She had become indispensable, not merely for strategies or intelligence, but because she had learned the delicate art of appearing loyal while remaining untouchable. In the king's eyes, she was flawless, in the shadows, untamed. A messenger arrived with news from the border provinces, bringing reports of unrest, rebellion, and shifting alliances. Where lesser favorites would panic, Elis thrived. She reviewed the reports quietly, formulating responses to satisfy the king's thirst for dominance, while subtly consolidating her own influence. Each suggestion was calculated to appear incidental, yet the ripples it would create extended far beyond the chamber. Her legacy was written not in triumphs, but in quiet orchestration of power. The court watched, unaware that the king's trust, once absolute, had been carefully calibrated by her hand. Alliances were guided, disputes diffused, and opportunities for rivals diverted. Her influence was invisible yet absolute, a shadow echoing the king's will while steering it subtly in directions only she understood. Even as she managed crises, she cultivated perception, the favorite who served faithfully, yet none could rival in foresight. By midday, her guidance had altered troop placements, secured critical supply lines, and prevented a minor uprising from escalating. Courtiers, unaware of the subtle manipulations at play, whispered among themselves, interpreting her success as coincidence, luck, or the king's benevolence. In truth, it was neither. It was mastery, the quiet dominance of a mind attuned to fear, ambition, and desire. The legacy of the king's favorite was rarely written in ink. It was etched in the careful choreography of human behavior. As evening fell, the castle's corridors became a labyrinth of shadows and flickering torchlight. Elis paused to observe movement and rumor. Each whisper that reached her ears, each glance exchanged between courtiers, was another thread she could pull or release. Power was transient, but the legacy of the astute survived long after rivals' bodies cooled. Those who sought to undo her influence were already caught in webs they could not perceive, and she smiled quietly at their naivety. The king retired to his private chambers, exhausted from the day's consultations. Elis lingered in the gallery, contemplating the arc of her ascent. She had become more than a favorite. She was the invisible hand shaping the kingdom's future, the fulcrum upon which loyalty and fear balanced. Her legacy would endure not in monuments or titles, but in the order, obedience, and subtle fear she cultivated. Those who remembered her would speak in hushed tones of the favorite who commanded without overt domination, wielding influence with precision of a blade unseen. In the quiet, the castle seemed to acknowledge her triumph. Torches flickered, shadows stretched and shifted, and every corridor hummed with echoes of calculated obedience. Lady Elis allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Survival had brought her this far, but legacy, true, enduring legacy, required vision, restraint, and a cold appraisal of every human instinct. In the king's shadow, she had discovered the ultimate truth. Power was fleeting, but the hand that guided it, unseen and untouchable, could endure forever. And so, as night settled across the stone walls, Lady Elis moved forward with measured steps. The court would remember her, not for audacity or favor alone, but for the quiet, inexorable mastery that made her indispensable and immortal in the minds of all who played their parts beneath the king's shadow.